All right, guys, this is Mr. Cannon here again, and today we're going to be in lesson 3 of U.S. government, and what we're going to be talking about is limited government and the Constitution. These are very important topics when we look at what kind of government we actually set up in America. And so we're going to start by looking at the Articles of Confederation. The actual first government we set up in America isn't the government that we have today. The first government of the United States was a failure. During the Revolution, after we declared our independence, we immediately set up a confederation. We're no longer a confederation, but what a confederation is a loose alliance of states. And that's what we really set up as our first plan of government. The document that governed us was called the Articles of Confederation. It was an attempt to limit the power of our new government because if you think about our history, we had just come from a very powerful central government with a king, and we were fearful that if we created a government that was too strong, that we could be in just as bad a shape as we were being run by England. So you can create your own government, but our founders believed if you create a government that's too powerful, that has too much authority, then we'll end up in the exact same position we were leading into the American Revolution. So they created a very, very weak central government, and the states could basically do whatever they wanted to do. And this confederation was really a loose alliance between those states. There was no executive branch, so there was no president of the United States then. There was no judicial branch, so there was no court system, at least a federal court system. Each state had their own court system, but there was no federal court system. And there was only a one-house legislature. So our Congress, our lawmaking body, was really only one house. And in that lawmaking body, each state got one vote. So you think about it, there were 13 original states, so you had 13 votes, and each state got a vote. It didn't matter how many people were in your state got one vote. In order to make laws, you had to have 9 of the 13 states agree. In order to change the Articles of Confederation, you had to have all 13 states agree. So it was very difficult to get things done. What we're going to find is that the Articles of Confederation were too weak. Our attempt at setting up a weak central government, we're going to go too far in doing so. And one particular event is going to really show that that government is too weak. Now, there were a lot of things that demonstrated the government was not strong enough, but the biggest one was called Shays' Rebellion. You can see the painting there of this rebellion in the background. But what Shays' Rebellion was it was a rebellion soon after the Revolution ended between a group of ex-soldiers who became farmers that were angry about not getting paid. They were really angry about the tax system that Massachusetts had set up. They couldn't afford to pay the taxes, and so they began to rebel. They began to say things like no taxation without representation, things like that. But this rebellion, the problem was there was no army and no strong central government that could put it down. You know, we couldn't call on the military to go in and stop this rebellion. Massachusetts basically had to deal with this themselves, and the rebellion was very difficult to contain. And because of that, it became clear to the leaders of America that this wasn't going to work. We were going to constantly have rebellions on and on and on if we didn't create a stronger government. If you look at the Articles of Confederation, there were several things that it could not do. It could not collect taxes for the federal government. Now, states could collect their own taxes, but the federal government could not collect taxes. The federal government could not raise an army. Each state had to voluntarily give soldiers if you wanted to have an army. And getting those states to cooperate was very difficult. So the central government wasn't strong enough, and we weren't going to have a country for very long if our founders didn't do something about it, if they didn't really get together and decide to fix the problem. So the result of these issues was a meeting in Philadelphia to discuss revising the articles. Very quickly, they figured out it was going to take more than revising the articles. We were actually going to have to create a new document and a new plan for government. And that organization, of course, became known as the Constitutional Convention. So the leaders in Philadelphia, eventually they're going to become known as the Constitutional Convention because they're going to start writing a new constitution. But before they could write that document, they had several issues that came up that had to be addressed. We're only going to talk about two of those issues, but there were actually more than that. But one of the biggest issues that had to be discussed was how you would appoint representatives from the states. You had a very big difference of opinion about how to do that. You had what was called the Virginia Plan. Virginia was a large state, so they wanted representation to be based on population. They said it's not fair that a small state like New Jersey would have just as much power in the Congress as a state like Virginia. Virginia has more people in it, so Virginia should have more power than New Jersey. Well, of course, New Jersey, they came up with their own plan where they said no, representation should be equal. Every state should have the same amount of representatives. So you had this standoff between the large states and the small states. The big states wanted what we call proportional representation. That means that representation was based on population. The small states wanted it to be equal. And so what happened is we had a compromise. It's called the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise created a two-house legislature or a two-house Congress. In one house, it would be based on population. Representation would be based on population. It would be proportional. So in that case, the Virginia plan got its way. And that house, by the way, is still today called the House of Representatives. California, for instance, has 55, I think it's 55 members of the House of Representatives. South Carolina has 7. Wyoming only has 1 because California is much bigger than Wyoming. It's bigger than South Carolina, so it has more representatives in the House of Representatives. But then when you go across the hall into the Senate is equal representation, where South Carolina has 2 senators, Wyoming has 2 senators, and California has 2 senators. So it's all equal. In order for a law to be passed, it has to go through both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So this Great Compromise was a way to say we're going to give something to the big states and we're going to give something to the small states. Another issue that came up was on how to count slaves. Now, thankfully, we don't deal with that today because slavery is illegal in America. But it wasn't back in the beginning. We know that. And so the issue became how to count slaves. Northern states wanted to count slaves for taxes to get more tax money out of the southern states, but they didn't want slaves to count for representation because that would mean that southern states got more representatives. The South wanted the exact opposite, of course. They wanted the slaves to count for representation, but not for tax purposes. So the compromise they came up with here was called the 3/5 Compromise, where they counted 3/5 of all the slaves. Now, if you actually think through this, that would mean you're counting a slave as 3/5 of a person, which is ridiculous. It's terrible, but that was the compromise they came up with. Slavery, of course, is an issue we're going to have to deal with in America, and eventually the Civil War is going to be fought partially over that issue, and thankfully slavery is going to go away. But it's going to be something that causes an issue and a problem from the very beginning. All right, once we get past the issues like slavery and like representation, now we can actually start writing the document. And the document that we're going to write is going to have a beginning to it called a preamble. You can read it there. The preamble is very simple. You may have memorized this in middle school. It's we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So they basically give their reasons for writing this Constitution. In other words, why did we get rid of the Articles of Confederation and why did we write the Constitution? It's because we needed to establish justice, ensure that things are safe, tranquility, have a defense, be able to raise an army, promote the general welfare, have liberty. If we want to keep liberty, we have to be able to defend ourselves. But the most important part of this preamble is the very first part. That part that says we the people. Those three words show more than anything else what kind of government our founders wanted to establish. And that was going to be a government of the people. In other words, a democracy. Now, it wasn't going to be a pure democracy or a direct democracy like we talked about in the last lesson, but it was going to be a type of democracy. And how we know that is we the people. The people are going to do this. That goes back to the social contract where the people agree to be governed. So how we know we have a type of democracy, we can see here right in the preamble with the term we, with the phrase we the people. All right, once we actually start creating the government, we're going to actually divide power into three different branches. One way we're going to try to ensure that the government doesn't become too powerful is dividing that power up. So we have three branches that the Constitution is going to deal with, and they're going to deal with them in three different articles. So if you read the Constitution, it's broken up into all these different articles. The first three articles deal with the branches of government. And the first article, Article 1, discusses the legislative branch. So what does the legislative branch actually do? Well, its main job, its primary job, is to make the law. Every government throughout history has to do three things with the law. They have to make the law, they have to enforce the law, and they have to interpret the law. In places that have a monarchy, that one king or queen does all of those things. That person makes the law, enforces it, and interprets it. In our government, it's divided, and the branch that actually makes the law is called the legislative branch. The head of the legislative branch is called the Congress. You can see that's the building that the Congress meets in, the Capitol building. It has two sides to it. It has the House of Representatives side, and then it has the Senate side. But together they form the legislative branch where they make the law. That's their job, make the law. Article 2 of the Constitution deals with the executive branch. And the executive branch's job is to enforce the law. So Congress makes that law. Now it's the executive branch's job to enforce it, to make sure that it's being carried out. That's another way to say that. The executive branch carries out the law. You know, if you think about the FBI, the federal police force, basically, they're part of the executive branch. Now, the head of the executive branch is the president. He leads that branch. He's in charge of that branch. Or she. One day it could be a she. But the president's in charge of the executive branch. And you can see there I have the White House in the background because that sort of symbolizes the executive branch. Now, the executive branch does a lot of things that we're going to look at in a future lesson. So we're not just going to stop here with the executive branch. We have a lot to talk about, but we're going to do that in a future lesson. All we're doing here is doing an overview of these three branches. Okay, Article 3 deals with the last branch of government. That's called the judicial branch. The judicial branch's job is to interpret the law. So once the law is made and it's enforced, now it's the judicial branch's job to determine if a law was actually broken, to interpret whether that law was broken, to interpret what the consequences of breaking that law should be. And actually, we know now that part of the judicial branch's job is to interpret whether the law is okay or not. The judicial branch can do something called judicial review, where they actually throw a law out if it breaks the Constitution. So they actually look at laws passed by Congress and they determine, yes, does this law violate the Constitution or does it follow the Constitution? And of course, this branch is led by the Supreme Court. 9 members are on the Supreme Court. These 9 people, they have a lot of influence in our society, but their main job, their primary job, is to interpret the law. That's what they do. So those are the 3 branches of government. You can see how power is divided. All right, the last thing we need to talk about are some hallmarks of the Constitution. When we look back at the founders and how they wrote the Constitution, there were several things that they wanted to make sure were in place in our Constitution. We're going to look at these more in depth in future lessons, so we're going to look at this in a much more detailed way. But what we want to do in this slide is look at the overview of these things. So, for instance, separation of powers. What you need to know the basic definition of that. That's where power is divided into different branches of government. Now, why did the founders want to do that? Well, they wanted to do it to ensure that no one person or no one group has too much power. Their view was that if you give one person or one group too much power, they'll abuse that power and they will take it out on the people. And if you think about their experience with the King of England, that's what they believed happened, that he was abusing his power. So what we wanted to do was separate power into different branches. A second hallmark of our Constitution is something called checks and balances. Checks and balances make sure that each branch has certain powers or checks over the other branches. This is to make sure that in the end, power is balanced between the 3 branches and that one branch isn't so much more powerful than the other branches. Now, is it perfectly even? No, it's not. Different times in our history, the president has been more powerful, the Congress has been more powerful, and now some people even say that the Supreme Court is more powerful than the other 2. But the bottom line is that each branch has certain checks over the other branches to try to balance that power out. A third hallmark of the Constitution is called federalism. We are a federal system. What that means is that power is divided not just between branches of government, but we divide power between levels of government. So federalism actually refers to having a federal government at the top, state governments underneath the federal government, and local governments underneath that. To give you an example, we have the federal government in Washington, D.C. There are certain things the federal government can do. Then in South Carolina, we have a state government, and states can make certain laws for themselves. There's certain powers they have. And then for me, for instance, I live in Lexington, South Carolina, so Lexington County has a government, and the town of Lexington has a government. That's called a local government, and there's certain things the local governments can do. And then power is also shared between those 3 levels of government. Now, the top level, of course, is the federal government. The president, the Congress, they're the top. They're the top level of government. But they're also the state governments and the local governments. That's called federalism. We're going to be looking way more at that in a future lesson. The last thing I want to talk about in this slide is the Bill of Rights. The last thing the founders decided they needed to do before they finished the Constitution was to create something called a Bill of Rights. And actually, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called our Bill of Rights. And all these amendments do is list specific rights that we all have as citizens of America that our government cannot take away. Things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and a whole host of other things that we're going to discuss in a future lesson. Those are called the Bill of Rights. But when we look at our Constitution, these are what we call the 4 big hallmarks of our Constitution. And we're going to be talking, like I said, more about this in a future lesson. So that's lesson 3 on limited government in the Constitution. Of course, as you answer the questions, be sure to go back over this video. It will help you with those. And if you have any questions, you can ask me, or if you're taking this with Ms. Lekovich, you can ask her. And we will talk to you later. Have a great day.